I would like, if I may, to take you on a strange journey.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Real Estate Realities with the Rebel Broker. My name's Robert Whitelaw, and I am the Rebel Broker. Licensed real estate broker in the state of California, member of the National Association of Real Tours. But please, don't hold that against me. Once again, paving the way to find our path to being our very own real estate rebel. I hope you're all making your way. It's kind of interesting to watch how things are unfolding in the economic world relating to some international stuff. And we may talk about that maybe later in the week or next week. Kind of doing a little bit more research right now, trying to figure out what it means for us on the ground, right? The reality of what would happen for us, our real estate investments, or our goals in general, as it affects our ability to save, to reach our goals, that type of thing. But today, I thought I would take some time to discuss dual agency. Now, before we jump into it, if you'd like to get in contact with me, the best way to do that is to head over to www.therebelbroker.com. You can click the link located in the upper right-hand corner, labeled Contact the Rebel Broker. Click on that little bad boy, and you'll be presented with some fields to enter. You can put in your email address, your name, and ask your question, or share your observation, or whatever kind of info you'd like to share with me. I'd be happy to hear it. I've had a couple of people ask me about dual agency. I suppose it could vary from state to state on what the rules are. But it can play a part, and I am not a pro-dual agency guy, by and large. I have done dual agency in the past, and under those circumstances, it was usually, the couple of times I'm thinking about, in one circumstance, the buyer and the seller actually requested that I do it. And the circumstances of the other actually made it make more sense for me to be a dual agent. So let's talk about what it is first, because it also actually has some subtle variances even within it. Now, in the state of California, dual agency is when the buyer and seller are represented by the same brokerage firm. And remember, multiple real estate agents work for the same brokerage firm. So let's say that brokerage firm A, or you could call it whatever, Intero or Century 21 or Coldwell Banker of wherever, right? Because there's bunches of different Coldwell Banker offices, but they're not all the same brokerage, right? Some of them are Coldwell Banker with a city name. There's usually some other words attached to it to differentiate it from other Coldwell Bankers. So there's different brokers usually owning those different franchises. But let's just go with brokerage A for now to make things simple. If you are a buyer and you are working with Jim at brokerage A and a home listed by Amy, who also works for brokerage A, two separate agents, but they both work for the same brokerage, that is still dual agency in the state of California. I don't have a problem with that from the standpoint of what the buyers and sellers are going to get. For all intents and purposes, the buyer and the seller aren't going to see any difference in that transaction versus if they were working for completely different brokerages. But they'll have to sign different disclosures, and there may take a little bit more explaining to make it clear why they're signing these extra disclosures. Now, I want to first lay out my problems with dual agency. And dual agency, in the way I'm describing it, that I think most buyers and sellers would understand, is when the same human being is representing both the buyer and the seller. So if Jim got a listing on a house, and during an open house, someone who wasn't represented by an agent came to view the house and decided to make an offer, and Jim was going to write that offer up for them, that's not just dual agency because it's the same brokerage. It's the same human being, right? Now, that's the one I have problems with. And we have to understand where the bias is on this, because you'll often find articles floating around out there about why dual agency is okay. But remember, it is in the vested interest of agents for folks to buy that it's a good thing. Why? Because it doubles their commission. When a seller lists a home, at least in the state of California, it may be different in other places, but by and large, there's a X% commission fee agreed on. Anywhere from typically, the typical numbers you see are 4 to 6% on a single-family residential home. It can go higher than that on certain types of homes, like mobile homes, and sometimes condos will also have a higher commission associated with them. But typically, what happens is you take that amount and you divide it by 2. So if it's a 6% commission on a house, 3% of it is going to go to the buying agent, and 3% of it's going to go to the selling agent. Well, if you get into a dual agency situation, clearly that works great for the agent because now the agent is getting the entire 6% instead of just 3%, right? They're not splitting it. So always remember that. Anytime someone is trying to validate why it's okay, or when if you're in that situation and they're trying to talk you into it, always keep that in mind. They are doubling their commission. Now, should their commission be doubled in that situation? Probably. They're now doing the entire job, so I can see where that would make sense. But let's talk about first the reasons why I have problems with it, and then we'll talk about times when it may make sense. The bottom line is that part of what you're earning as a real estate agent is your knowledge and your experience, and you're supposed to be using that to the full advantage of your client. Well, if you're doing that for both the buyer and the seller, if you're the listing agent, you already know a lot more about the seller than a normal buyer's agent would. So it puts you in a position where it's almost like you then have to disconnect your experienced professional real estate savvy, because in order to do the job right, you're supposed to not let what you already know about the seller sway you. Your seller may have shared things with you that they wouldn't have shared with the agent representing the other side. Odds are they did. So the bottom line is you have information that an agent who's representing the buyer should not have. I would also argue that if an agent says that's not the case, well, then you're not doing your job correctly as a listing agent. The bottom line is you didn't get enough information about the goals, the desires, and where your sellers are going to why they're doing what they're doing and what their end game is. If you didn't suss all of that stuff out ahead of time, then you really did a very poor job of listing that house. You should know things that a buyer's agent shouldn't know as part of your job in helping them not only get their home sold, but get it sold in a way that dovetails as cleanly as possible with their overall goals. It tends to disconnect the negotiation process because you suddenly find yourself in a legal situation as an agent where you can't communicate to the buyer what the seller will go down to, and you can't communicate to the seller what the buyer will go up to. So in doing that, you're kind of short-circuiting a lot of potential negotiation strategizing that you might otherwise use. So it's impossible for you to, and I realize a lot of folks try to phrase this, they try to put it in the frame of a win-win, as opposed to, they don't want it to be phrased as a confrontational situation. When folks are trying to validate or excuse this activity, they're saying, well, it's all just about finding agreement. Well, yeah, but if that's all it was, agents are getting paid too much for that, right? The point is that as your agent, I'm selling my skills and abilities to get you a better deal than what most folks get. That's why I'm there. If I'm unable to do that, then I need to stop doing it because apparently I'm not real good at it. I need to be beating the average by a good chunk in order for me to feel okay about what I'm doing, and in order for me to be able to sell my clients on what I have to offer in terms of being their real estate agent. And doing this sort of short circuits that. Now, one thing that I think sort of tips the scales a little bit here is situations where both parties through whatever means, have already agreed on what the home is going to sell for. This was a very weird one for me. I had a couple who were getting divorced where one of the two parties to the divorce was going to buy the home from the other. And so I listed it and I sold it to the other spouse. And so I got the whole commission, but the negotiation part wasn't really the problem, right? They'd already come up with that number. Now, they based it on a broker's opinion of value that they asked me to do for them. But my role in that transaction was different. And because it's a transaction born out of a level of conflict, I mean, a divorce can be a very tricky thing. A lot of emotions can run high. In that situation, I become more of a mediator than anything else. In a situation like that, I'm trying to help everybody else see everybody else's point of view and try to define what's reasonable for them, or at least flash a light on what's reasonable. In a situation like that, if you had two separate agents representing the two separate parties, I think the potential for a meltdown would have been much greater. So maybe in some scenarios, having a dual agent, having the same human being handle both sides makes sense. But both times that in recent memory that I've done dual agency a few times, but the two times I can remember most recently, as a side effect of doing dual agency, I charged less for the commission than I normally would. So you as a buyer or seller should not feel shy. If you find yourself in a situation where this is another reason where dual agency may pay off for you. If you find yourself in a situation where your agent is representing both sides, the next conversation you should have is about how much of a discount there's going to be on that agent's commission. And you can figure out how you want to work that out. You can figure out if you're going to drop the commission and credit half of it to the buyer and half of it to the seller, whatever decision you can come up with, whatever concessions you can get. But given the fact that the process sort of naturally short circuits a lot of the value that an agent is supposed to bring when it comes to that negotiation part of the deal, I think it's perfectly reasonable to expect to get a discount on the commission. And I know that this show is going to generate far more emails than usual from agents who are very angry with me for suggesting that. But I think it's absolutely fair, and I think it's a conversation you should have. If the agent can somehow convince you that they are earning that full commission, even though they're in a situation where they really can't bring their full negotiation skills to bear because they're doing it against themselves and they already have information they shouldn't already have in terms of how they're representing the seller and possibly the buyer, then great. Then maybe they can convince you they deserve that entire amount. But absolutely give that some serious thought. It's something that you should consider carefully if you're willing to let them do that and strictly use it as a way to lower your costs or perhaps to cover your closing costs, right? Have them credit you a certain amount of money that will then go to your non-recurring closing costs. However, if you do that, you need to sort of own the negotiation process a little bit more. And by that, I mean maybe ask more difficult questions, ask more pointed questions, have a little bit more of a and I hate to say confrontational, but perhaps a little bit more of a aggressive relationship with your agent and see if you can't be that little bit, that edge of aggressiveness in terms of negotiating so that you can get the best possible terms and conditions for yourself out of the transaction. And that applies to both the buyer and the seller. Another thing I think it's smart to do is to understand completely the relationship between the agent and these two parties, the buyer and the seller. You want to know how the two parties got introduced to the real estate agent. Obviously, they got a listing from the seller. You want to make sure there's not a personal relationship between the agent and either one of the two parties. I think that crosses a line no matter what the circumstances are to where one party is going to be at a disadvantage if there's a personal relationship involved in there. Now, if you're just looking for an agent who isn't necessarily going to be playing a big part in the negotiation process. If you're just looking for an agent where the circumstances call more for a mediator than for a realtor or a real estate agent, well, then that's the kind of person you want to bring in. You can bring in an agent who's going to play that role. Because I'll tell you, one thing that is a downside of having two agents involved in the process is the personalities. Now you're introducing two new personalities where one of them may be more of a problem than a solution. A really good example, I talked about this a couple of months ago. I had an escrow where everything was seeming to go wrong, and the other party seemed very unreasonable in terms of what was being communicated to me through the agent. And at some point during an inspection, the other parties were there, and they started a conversation with me, and it became very clear that all of these things that were making it very difficult to get anything done were not coming from these folks, but from their agent. And I don't know if that person thought that they were making things better. I don't know if they thought they were doing a good thing for their clients. That may well be. They may have thought that, I'm using my expertise to really stick it to the other side. But the truth of it is they weren't sticking anything to anybody, and they were simply making my clients feel less and less like going through with the transaction. It actually had to come down to a conversation where I said, listen, we're at the point now where my folks are willing to simply back away. We're within the time frame where we can do that and still walk away with our entire deposit. So, because of the pushback we've seen from you, we're going to need you to sign off on all these things in order for this to work for us. And that's what ended up happening. But it just goes to show that sometimes something completely independent from the terms and conditions of the property or the contract, personalities can come in and play a negative part. So under those circumstances, when you look at it from that perspective, it may feel like a better choice to have one agent representing both sides. I think a lot of it depends on your situation and what you think the biggest value add is of the agent who's involved. Now, in my case, I've always argued that most of the work, the real work that goes on, isn't when you list the house. It's not with the marketing. The real work that goes on, the stuff that matters most to the buyers and the sellers, is what happens in escrow. I mean, that needs to happen in a way where everyone's interests are looked after, all the right reports and inspections are generated, and when there are little red lights that flash in the back of the realtor's mind because of the experience they have that clues them in to tell the buyer, you may want to get this inspection as well, because of past experiences where they've seen things point to bigger problems or just instinctive things that happen once you've been doing real estate for a long time. If that's really just what you're looking for, someone who's experienced with the process of going through escrow and guiding you through, I think that a dual agency can work under those circumstances. My biggest problem is when conflicts occur that require negotiation, which would be at the beginning of the transaction relating to setting the price, setting the terms, how much down payment, how long do you get to satisfy these requirements, those types of things. And then if issues come up in the middle of escrow, if there's certain repairs that need to be done, who's going to pay for those? Now, you can also make the argument that, again, once you've gotten to that point and you have a signed contract, that's more of a mediation. I often feel like my role is oftentimes to be a mediator as much as possible between my clients and the other side, even when it's another agent involved on the other side. So it really depends on your particular situation. But I'll be honest with you, what I do, I don't do dual agencies unless I find myself in that situation where either the price is already agreed upon, or perhaps it's already a situation where there's potentially a high level of conflict between the buyer and the seller, and they're really looking for someone to serve more as a mediator, and adding another agent to that mix would actually just make things worse. I've done that. But that's the exception, I think, to what is a fairly reasonable rule. Now, remember, dual agency is absolutely legal. There's nothing illegal about it. In my opinion, it's just unethical because I don't think it lives up to the standard of my fiduciary responsibility to my clients. My job is to represent the interest of my clients to the absolute best of my ability, and I'm hobbled in doing that if I'm expected to represent the absolute best interest of the buyer and the seller at the same time, at least during the negotiation phase of the transaction. So how do I live up to that? What happens if I'm listing a house and a buyer comes in who is going to want to make an offer and they want me to be their agent? Well, I don't do it. A good example is this weekend. I have one person who came to an open house I was holding, and they're talking about making an offer, and they asked if I would be their agent. So what do? Well, I respectfully let them know that I'm already representing the seller, so it would be, while it wouldn't be illegal, I consider it unethical in this circumstance for me to represent you. So here is an agent from my office who can represent you and get us through this process. Now, that's still dual agency, right? Because it's the same brokerage. This other agent works for me, but it's a different human being. That person doesn't know all the nitty-gritty details about my seller. She's never held the house open. She's never talked to my sellers. She doesn't know what their goals are. She doesn't know ultimately how low they'll go or any other information about the process. So we can just negotiate at each other. And I'm going to explain why I think this actually works to your advantage when it's dual agency, but this way, where it's two different physical people. Because I have a relationship with this agent, there is no personal baggage. For whatever freakishly weird reason, agents seem constantly in need of proving themselves to other agents that they're awesome. I had a transaction last year where an agent was saying things that were very odd in terms of just indicating that they hadn't really done this much. I don't have a problem with that. Every agent has their turn being new. But this agent kept phrasing things like, of all the transactions I've done, this has never happened before. And I'm thinking, well, this happens every time. I don't know where you've been selling houses, but this happens every single time. And I went and I looked up this person's history, and sure enough, this was their first escrow, at least according to the MLS. They may have deals that for some reason didn't end up in the MLS. Very unlikely, although I have deals that don't end up in the MLS from time to time. But I'll tell you what, that didn't start happening until after I'd been in the business for 10 to 15 years. So, and this person had only been licensed for less than a year, had no closed transactions under the MLS. So it was one of those things that left me concerned because I had someone who felt like they had something to prove, and that's the absolute worst kind of agent you want in a situation like that. So you avoid that. By going with dual agency, I know my agents. We've been working together for several years. It becomes just about the deal. It doesn't become about this other person proving that they're good at what they do with me or that they need me to feel intimidated by their expertise. Those things just go out the window, and it gets focused on the facts. And I love deals like that. But there's also a slight downside there too, because one tactic I use when I'm negotiating is I will look up agents. When I'm going to go and I'm going to make an offer on a house, I like to look up and see how hungry an agent is. In other words, when was the last time they closed an escrow? If they haven't closed an escrow in 4 or 5 months, the odds are they're going to be hot to get this thing closed. That tells me I can probably go with a lower offer and have this agent support my offer with the seller. I can probably go in there, come in with a lower ball offer. And if I have a conversation with this agent ahead of time and use some statistical data or other things to convince them of why we came up with that number, I find that those agents will fight for my offer because I've given them ammunition they can use against the seller, and they're hungry for a check. So, there are these things that go on for someone doing things responsibly where that wouldn't happen if I was the single individual on both sides of that transaction, right? You can argue maybe that's not a good thing, but it's definitely a good thing for my client and ends up in a better number for the person whose fiduciary responsibility I owe. So just to sort of recap, dual agency, there's kind of two physical manifestations of it. One is you're being represented by the same brokerage but different human beings. I don't think that one's a problem. I don't think you should even blink at that one. That one I think is completely normal in terms of not having any negative side effects for you. In fact, could even have a benefit for you. It could eliminate that pissing match we talked about, but that happens sometimes between agents. Because these would probably be folks who know each other, have at least met each other a few times, and because they're going to stay in the same office together for a long time, are not going to do stupid things to each other just to be annoying. But then there's the situation where you find yourself faced with having to deal with a proposition where one agent is going to represent both parties. I'm going to suggest that the vast majority of the time that is not in your best interests, and you should try to find a solution that eliminates that problem with the agent. However, circumstances change, and you may find that your situation is that 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 where dual agency makes sense. And what you need in that transaction is less of a negotiator and more of someone who can simply be that one point between two parties to serve as a mediator, and you eliminate potential strife by having one person simply serving as that mediator position between the two. Yeah? Does that make sense? I hope so. I get questions on dual agency fairly frequently, and I think I must have mentioned it in a show a couple of weeks ago because I got some mail on it where folks asked me what the heck dual agency is. And I hope that cleared it up for you. I hope that makes it a little bit more understandable, but also gives you some options in terms of situations where you may want to use it or situations where you absolutely, without a doubt, are going to tell your agent to come up with another solution because you're not going to allow your situation to be handled with someone, the same human being handling both sides. All right, folks. As I mentioned at the head of the show, if you'd like to get in contact with me, head on over to www.therebelbroker.com. I'd love to get your ideas, suggestions, observations, or any of your personal experiences, whether they're good or bad, so that I can share them with the group. And of course, if you've got a couple of minutes extra during the day, send the show a little love. Give it a review over on iTunes or some thumbs up or some stars, whatever the method of rating is for whatever tool you use to consume the show. As always, thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you all next time.